Hello, everyone. The following is a podcast I recorded with my good friend and colleague Daniel Levine. We discuss everything related to the Israel-Hamas War. We talk about the trajectory of the war, the Iranian attack against Israel, Israel's expected retaliation, and the invasion of Lebanon, and the role of the UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and how they're caught in the crossfire. What is their role? What does it mean to be a UN peacekeeper between Israel, Lebanon, and Hezbollah? I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in there as well.
Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are back with our featured guest, Dr. Alon Burstein, here to unpack everything that's been happening in the Middle East in the last couple of weeks. So, Alon, welcome to the podcast.
Always good to see you, Daniel. I'm now far away from you.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought, in the past year, your expertise would probably be called upon many more times a day than you could possibly imagine. Let's unpack the big picture right now. We're talking Thursday. It's about 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. Bibi Netanyahu has just gotten off the phone with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They're talking about this potential Israeli strike on Iran before America was sort of urging diplomacy and saying, they don't want Israel to strike. Obviously, we know Bibi Netanyahu, at least from my read, it seems like he really does, although he's been saying that for many years. Can you just sort of unpack the bigger picture, set the stage for why now with Iran after, a year after October 7th?
So the escalation with Iran has really come in two different waves. Iran, for all of its rhetoric over the years, has always been, funding proxies and sending weaponry to Hezbollah, helping train Hamas, helping this. For all of its rhetoric, they've never actually sacrificed a single soldier or a single missile or a single everything against Israel until this year. What happened when the war broke out, Iran really stepped up all of its weapon smuggling to Hezbollah and to other affiliated organizations, largely through Syria. Around February, Israel started to attack those weapon shipments and more adamantly also attack Iranian Revolutionary Guard, so targeting, what's considered Iran itself, not just the proxies. Then in April, there was a famous strike that Israel carried out against the Iranian consulate or the affiliated building of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing the commander of the Quds forces in charge of Syria and Lebanon. In response to that, Iran retaliated with its first barrage of projectiles ever. Missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones fired towards Israel in April. And Israel officially never retaliated. In reality, about a week later, we saw detonations going off in the air defenses of nuclear facilities in Natanz and Isfahan, and other attacks in Baghdad and Damascus against Iranian sort of targets. Then it died down. That was like a wave, and then it died down. Then we started to see Iran, as far as it was concerned, getting pushed to the corner again. We had the escalations between Israel and Hezbollah that started to happen at the end of July. Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, is assassinated in Tehran on July 31st. So this is in the capital of Iran when he was there actually for the inauguration of the Iranian president. As far as they're concerned, that's pretty big humiliation. And then they vowed retaliation for that. And in addition to that, with these escalations, Israel assassinated Hassan Nasrallah on September 27th. Iran felt that now it was actually being ridiculed quite a lot in international Arab media, and pushed to the wall. Iran felt, okay, now I have to do some retaliation. That said, unlike in April, this retaliation was actually seemingly meant to do some damage. The attack that Iran had done in April was an attack that you and I were talking while the missiles were flying. Like it was cruise missiles, drones. It took 8 hours to get there. Very easy to intercept. These were ballistic missiles. 180 ballistic missiles. They take about 10, 12 minutes to get from Iran to Israel. They each were packing between 700 kilos and 1 ton of explosives. That's already a much more serious attack. In turn, Israel is saying, well, in that case, Iran may be due for a much more serious retaliation in the form of an actual IDF strike. Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran's two proxies that could have threatened Israel in any meaningful way, are now very much on the run. They're very much already engaged with the IDF. Now might be the time for the IDF to seize the opportunity. That's how we've gotten to where we are now, everyone waiting.
So I've read some accounts, and I'm just curious to run this by you, that suggest that given that Iran really did try to pack a punch in its strike, by now, a week and a half ago, and it didn't. I mean, obviously one person died, a couple people got injured, maybe some military bases got hit, but this was hardly, the great destruction Iran probably hoped to have. it actually showed that Iran was a little bit of a paper tiger in the region in terms of their missile capabilities. I'm curious just to run that by you. Do you think that that is a reasonable conclusion, or do you think that Iran still was only going 5 or 10%? And if they're only going 5 or 10%, I mean, why, right? Like, I get the show of force that maybe they did in April, and I get going all out and finally saying, okay, enough is enough. We need to take out Israel. Why do this weird 10 to 15% where they know they're not really going to take out any Israeli military capability? Are they just trying to inflame things? Do they just have to do it for some, purposes of honor?
I would say probably the last thing you said, because really, like so many things in the war, when I get asked about like, will there be a ceasefire, Israel, Hamas, who's interested? What is the situation with Hezbollah? What is the situation, the United States pressuring Israel or not? My answer is always look to internal politics. When you look to internal politics, you will understand how the actors are governing themselves in the war. You've heard me say that a million times. Within Iran, there are two different factions that are disagreeing about the war. One is the more moderate side, led by the current new Iranian president. He comes from a background of economy. He does not want to waste a lot of mostly money and also resources in funding this war. Iran's economy is not doing well, and Iran engaging itself in conflict and in war, sending money, sending soldiers, sending advisors, to him is just bleeding the country dry. He is the one who, ever since the assassination that happened again in his inauguration of Ismail Haniyeh, was actually holding the Iranian military back and saying, no, no, we do not need to retaliate. No, we do not need to engage. In turn, there's the more, radical side, so to speak, led by different elements within the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and supported largely by the supreme leader, Khamenei, who have been saying that no, Iran does need to engage. Now, what seemingly happened after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah is they came to some sort of bargain. They came to some sort of, okay, you can't say we're not going to engage anymore, but we're not going to try to have an all-out war. We'll try to do it in a way that's largely like April, right? A little bit more show of force. Maybe we'll be hit a little bit more, but I think their hope is that Israel does not actually use this as an opportunity to have a full escalation. This time, maybe instead of detonations happening in near a nuclear facility, Israel will carry out a direct bombing, but nothing major, and we could call it there. I think that's probably what ended up leading to this sort of more meaningful retaliation, but still very limited.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating, just the way in which war is carried out nowadays, where you just have these weeks of public media deliberations. I mean, I don't know, maybe, I mean, I'm sure in the medieval ages, it was probably some equivalent when you had the two armies camped out on the hills, but it's just so strange that now, every news story for the last week has been Israel considering a massive attack, Biden saying no, I don't know. It just seems strange that this isn't just all happening behind closed doors and the media even has insights into this. And it's just, I don't know. This isn't really a question. It's just,
But it doesn't
stunning.
have, but I will say that like when the United States was invading Iraq, there were a lot of similar things about the different opposing sides within the Pentagon about how the attack should be carried out. I remember also looking at that, I was, 18 at the time, 19, looking at it through maps, showing like, some people say you should go from here, others say you should go from here. And I was saying the same thing. I was like, but shouldn't these people say saying it to each other? Shouldn't they be
Mhm.
saying it like within the media? But like already then, and that was, think about it, before social media, before leaks come out that way. So I think that's one of the things that just created this.
No, the other night I was reading, I mean, I was, obviously endlessly interested in this, and I was reading, full Reddit debates and analyses over exactly what Israel should do. And I'm like, who are these people that are writing up, 500-word essays on Reddit of military strategy for countries they don't live in? I mean, I don't know. I guess some people have, potentially a little bit more free time than we do. Part of the backdrop to a lot of this is the fact that Israel, and I'm going to choose my words carefully, and you can let me know if you agree with the strong choice of words. Israel seems to have effectively neutered Hezbollah in a record short amount of time. I mean, of course, we had the pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, then the many bombings of Hezbollah strongholds in Beirut, and it just seems to have been completely snowballing to the point where now it kind of seems like Hezbollah is poised to fall at any minute. I think I read this morning the IDF is now finally on the offensive, and they were able to cut through the sort of elite fighting force of Hezbollah. In terms of, let's say either the strength of Hezbollah or either the Iranian attachment there, I mean, is rooting out Hezbollah. I mean, I know we've talked many times on the podcast, and we've talked about this idea of, full elimination of Hamas. And we've, both said, and, you especially has said, that's kind of, a dream.
It's not a
What does
thing.
that mean? And we'll talk about Gaza in a little bit. Hezbollah seems a little bit more different, at least as far as I know. One, Hezbollah isn't really the government, right? It's one of the militias there. There also is a Lebanese government. There also is a Lebanese people that don't really like Hezbollah. I mean, it's been stunning to see, how many people in Lebanon and Syria, we'll get to that in a minute, were happy that Hassan Nasrallah was killed. Obviously, he supported the Assad regime in Syria, right? He's been, terrible to many of the people in Lebanon. Do you see a situation in which Israel is just saying, okay, we just have to go for the knockout punch. We have to take out Hezbollah, whether or not that drags Iran into it, fine. But like our main goal is we're not going to stop until Hezbollah is gone. Do you think that there's a potential point of view in that strategy, right? Is that a possibility?
Short answer, no. And only because, like, almost first of all, like with Hamas, what does it mean to destroy all of Hezbollah? Hezbollah is a very strong militia. It is also a political party. They have parliamentarians. Does that mean killing them too? It has people in cabinet. It has radio stations. It has gas stations. It has its own banking system. It has the idea that you're going to eliminate Hezbollah is something that, from an academic point, I'll say operationalizing that. Okay, what does that actually mean? Is very complicated. What does that mean in terms of their elimination? Is it eliminating all of their militants? Okay, but then they have other supporters. Are they not going to become the next militants? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. This is why the idea that you can just eliminate a terrorist group by sheer force is very difficult. It's not that you can't kill everyone, but it's that at the end of the day, what terror groups, the advantage that they have is all it takes is 5 missiles, one of them to get through, and they've achieved a goal. Right? You can't then carry on your normal life. The way Israel changed the official goals of the war was not even to destroy Hezbollah. It was to allow the safe return of Israelis to the north of Israel. It's important that that's how they phrased it when the cabinet changed the aims of the war. They did not say destruction of Hezbollah, seemingly because they knew that wasn't possible. Also because they know that it's going to end in some sort of diplomatic resolution. What they want is to be able to say we've allowed the safe return. However, again, if Hezbollah still has a bunch of missiles, all it takes is, 2 people with knowledge and 10 missiles, and you can stop the Israelis from being able to come back to the north safely. Thinking about it in terms of numbers for a second, I don't disagree at all that Hezbollah has suffered monumental blows. There's a monumental blows have been stellar success for the IDF on many, many levels, so much so that Naim Qassem, the deputy of Hassan Nasrallah and the current de facto leader of Hezbollah, has largely said our bluff has been called. The bluff that Nasrallah for a year was saying there will never be a ceasefire between us and Israel until the ceasefire in Gaza. He gave a speech 2 days ago in which he said we'll support any ceasefire initiative that is part of that is what the Lebanese government wants. He said we're not going to negotiate terms, which means Israel won't agree, but the word Gaza was not mentioned in that. So in that sense, Israel succeeded and the bluff was called. At the same time, according to estimates of what was prior to the war, Hezbollah had between 130 and 150,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. It also had, according to, again, different estimates of the IDF and other actors, between 30,000 and 40,000 operatives. Now, if we go to the numbers on the ground, coming now a year into the war, Hezbollah has fired roughly 12,000 rockets and missiles and has lost, according to Hezbollah, 500 operatives. According to the IDF, much more, 800 operatives, and maybe another 4,000 are injured. That is out of the, again, 30,000 to 40,000 operatives. And even if it fired 12,000 missiles, and let's say that Israel even took out most of their other missiles, so they have only 25% left. So we're only talking about 30,000 rockets and missiles and a handful of operatives. The idea that the IDF is going to go for some sort of knockout blow, again, all it takes is a few operatives that are alive and a couple of missiles, and Hezbollah is still alive. So in that sense, the only way that it actually will be neutralized is through agreement, either agreement with the Lebanese government, somehow getting the Lebanese government to enforce the situation down south, or what is more common, agreements with the organizations. All governments love to say we don't negotiate with terror organizations, but all governments do negotiate with terror organizations and come to hostage deals with them, and they come to ceasefire agreements with them. That is the only way that the fire will actually stop. There's some sort of resolution like that. Otherwise, you're just in it for the long haul of an entrenchment war.
What a lot of people point to, and this is sort of the devil's advocate from, I'll say, the more hardline Israeli right approach, is that in 2006, the terms of, the cessation of the Second Lebanon War wasn't kept, right? The UN was supposed to keep a border. And then, of course, anytime anything gets rough, the UN just, runs away. If you're even more conspiratorial, the UN is, actually a nefarious agent in a lot of these cases. So I would say from what I'm hearing from a lot of, really the Israeli center and the right, to the extent that there's an Israeli left, I guess we're still looking for them. But it really is, you sort of have no other choice, right? I mean, so maybe they would say, I'm sure if, Bibi Netanyahu hopped onto the Zoom call right now, we'd say, granted, you're right. It's very difficult, if not maybe even impossible to root out, terrorism, but there's no other choice, because if you do try to negotiate with Hezbollah, they just recharge, and maybe, in 3 years from now, we're at the situation again. If you do pass it to a foreign government, either the UN as a foreign body or just some other actor in the region, right? All you need to do is wait till Hezbollah's ready again, and they'll probably leave. So, what is, I guess, the argument for Israel not just taking out Hezbollah as much as they can and just saying, listen, this is the best of all bad options?
So I'll correct one thing before I answer. The UN peacekeepers that are UNIFIL, the mission to southern Lebanon, are not meant to enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701. The Lebanese government is the one that's supposed to enforce that. That's an important distinction, because while they are heavily criticized for not actually stopping Hezbollah activity, that's not actually within their mandate. They're not physically allowed
So
because
then
of.
what is, I mean, so just for listeners that think the UN is a joke, I just talked to Joe Walsh, who, ran for president in 2020 against Trump. And, now it's interesting. He's now one of the heads of Republicans for Harris. So, interesting political 180 there. But we talked about the UN at the end, and in Congress, he actually tried to defund all US giving to the UN, right? Pretty common among Republicans. The argument that the UN is relevant. I mean, what is the point of UN peacekeeping troops or whatever you call them being on a border between two countries if they're not able to enforce anything? It almost seems worse for Israel, because maybe it's a false sense of security if there is a buildup there, right? I mean, it was the same thing, just to add on. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Same thing in 1967, same thing in 73, right? When these armies attacked, right? One of the first big things that happened was, armies were building up, and the UN basically said, all right, all UN troops out. So I guess, what is the point of the UN even having troops?
So I mean, I'm not going to get into it in great detail, just because that'll derail our whole conversation. But I actually just spoke about this in my course 2 weeks ago. We had a whole conversation about the UN and what the role of peacekeepers are. Joke or no joke, this is just what the world has. The peacekeepers, by definition, are sent to an area, first of all, where there is, it's supposed to be keeping the peace, not enforcing the peace. It doesn't mean that there is peace. They're sent to conflict zones, but they are only sent to a place where the sides have agreed to engage in diplomatic resolution. So the premise of peacekeepers is that the sides have an interest in keeping the peace. And then they are there to actually report and to theoretically have a show of force in order to help the sides and report back to the UN. So UNIFIL does actually help support a lot of activities on the ground that the UN does have a purview to do in order to bring about UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And it does also report back to the UN. It's just most countries slash all countries have not given the UN permission to come and actually enforce peace treaties in their area. The UN peacekeepers are only allowed to be in a country if that country agrees. It's different than humanitarian intervention. It's different when NATO got involved in Libya. These things are done, or in Yugoslavia. These things are former Yugoslavia. These things are done against the country's will. Peacekeepers are there only as to the extent that the country agrees. Why? UN agreements. That's what the United Nations says. The United Nations does not give the charter does not give the UN the right to go into a sovereign country and enforce what the UN wants. I'll say in a caveat to those on the Israeli side who are critical of that should probably be pretty thankful that the UN does not actually have the mandate to go and enforce in countries
But this
what
is
the UN
presumably, I mean, just
thinks.
to reformulate the question, and I'm, far more about the UN than I do. I think what people would, what I can imagine listeners asking is, let's say in 2006, both sides did agree to this, right? To have the UN, peacekeeping force in, and that comes with, maybe an assumption that there's goodwill between the sides, and there's a de facto ceasefire. Then for one side to break the ceasefire, right, Hezbollah, to then break it, October 8th or 9th or whatever. To what extent? I mean, if it's just a placeholder until, I guess, what's the point in the first place? Why is for the hardline approach, why is the international community even spending money on salaries for people? If you have the goodwill, fine. If me and you make a resolution that I'm not going to go into your house, you're not going to go into mine, as long as that goodwill holds, you don't need the guy in the middle. And the second one of us changes their mind, the guy in the middle leaves. What's the point of that guy in the middle in the first place?
There are situations, there's many situations and many conflicts where peacekeepers do help to quell sides because, in this case, right, the sides that are recognized by the UN are not the actual sides that are violating the UN Security Council resolution. So, in that sense, it's not necessarily the same comparison as a situation where, for example, you might have had the Lebanese army advancing towards the border, Israel lodging a complaint in the UN saying, the treaty is being violated, we might, be forced to A, B, and C, and the peacekeepers either being given a different mandate, which they can be, given a different mandate in order to try to enforce something or send more troops in or something like that, or at least reporting or something like that. Again, there have been cases in the civil war in Ethiopia, there have been cases in Rwanda, cases in Azerbaijan and Armenia, not necessarily keeping the peace, even coordinating mass evacuation of people. There have been situations where peacekeepers have facilitated, but that all those examples are when the two sides have agreed, yes, we'd like this to happen and we'd actually like international help to have this happen. In terms of the UN peacekeepers ensuring the two countries that want to go to war or two entities that want to go to war don't, that's never happened. That's
Got
never
it. Got it.
happened. And in that sense, again, the UN defense would be that's not the job. Maybe it should be. I agree, but that's theoretically not even the job of peacekeepers. Why? Because when the people were setting up the UN, I mean, again, going back historically, the United States and the Soviet Union were very scared to say
Yeah.
that there
I
could
mean,
be
I
an
guess
international force that will come in and force a treaty on people.
yeah, no, I guess it gets into sort of like, questions of what makes a just war. And, one of the frustrating things, I mean, at least I found it frustrating. I imagine most of, Israel has, is this idea of, okay, after 2006, there's a de facto, ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, right? Or 1701, right? Just I got the number
Yeah.
right. There we go. Hezbollah breaks that, and the UN, of course, as you just delineated before, right? It's not really their mandate to uphold that, but then all of a sudden, they're now criticized by that same UN for striking back heavily. And it's like, well, hey, either there are rules or there aren't rules. Part of the double standard that I think exists in Israel, and I think it probably makes it harder that a lot of times it's fighting against non-real state actors, right? That probably adds a little quagmire to the situation, is the situation of, okay, so one side is accountable to basically nobody internationally, right? Not the EU, not America, not any of these other groups. And another one is held super accountable. And even in the media, I mean, I've complained about this to you before, so this isn't news to you, but just to highlight for listeners, I mean, even in terms of media, right? Israel has more freedom of press than other countries in the Middle East, right? I won't say complete, freedom of press because we both know that's not true. But right, has a lot more freedom of press than Syria, Lebanon, certainly Gaza, and so understandably, there's going to be a lot more people in the media to write stories. The job of the media is to check the government and, government corruption and everything there. So it ends up turning out that Israel seems much worse than, because no one's even able to cover corruption in Gaza from inside of Gaza. So it just seems all connected to this standard. And this leads, the reason why I'm laying out this argument as I am is because one of the things that I think you hear a lot of Israelis feel right now is, well, who cares about norms? Who cares about the globalized world order? Who cares about liberalism? Right? Same reason that I think a lot of people in America, right? I think a lot of Trump voters' basic philosophy is they feel like the far left is being illiberal, therefore they're going to be illiberal back, right? As opposed to maybe, I would say, maybe double down on liberalism, right? So Israel's like, okay, these groups are illiberal, we'll just be illiberal more and illiberal stronger. So I think that's sort of the sharp view of a lot of that. So just to pass that back to you.
I mean, there's a lot that you threw out there. I think
I
that
don't want to make this too easy for you. It's
I would forbid I do miss our chats. I think that the idea that Israel is more accountable than the entities that it is commonly fighting often is true, but it's also true from the flip side, Israel also has representation in international bodies. Israel also benefits from treaties and being a member of a lot of international organizations, which Lebanon, Syria do not, which certainly Gaza does not. If you're a citizen of Israel, you could travel to many different places. You can hold bank accounts in many different places. If you're a citizen of Lebanon, you cannot hold bank accounts in certain places because there's all these sanctions on your country. Certainly, if you're a citizen of Syria, right? I mean, there's two different sides that I think if you're talking about how most Israelis feel, that most Israelis tend to ignore when they say, "Well, I don't care about how this ends up looking." To hell with the international community. Okay, but then you can't actually complain when you no longer can import or export anything from different countries like any of these other countries. There's a reason their economies are in shambles. Then you can't actually complain when your passport isn't really worth anything anymore. Like if you're a Syrian citizen or if you don't have a passport, like if you're in Gaza. So in many ways, yes, it is true that a state is held to a different standard than non-state actors, and maybe that's wrong from an ethical, moral standpoint. Of course, it's wrong. What we should care about is human lives, not if you're defined as a state, not a state. But our international laws and governing systems end up pertaining to states, and in that sense, Israel is in a situation where it's fighting entities that aren't made to be held accountable. It also benefits a hell of a lot from being a state as opposed to these other states. And it's just that distinction between states and non-states is something that often I think is overlooked. And again, I'm not making the justification for it. Is it right or not right? I'm saying this is just how the international community works. I've been asked often, Israel is being sued in the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. Why isn't Hamas being sued? And I said, because Hamas is not a state. You cannot sue Hamas in the International Court of Justice. Only states can appear before the International Court of Justice. You can hold non-state actors accountable for crimes against humanity. That's why the International Criminal Court, in addition to requesting arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, also requested arrest warrants for Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and also Mohammed Def and Ismail Haniyeh, who have since been assassinated.
It's going to be a very awkward jail cell if they're all stuck in there together. I hope they at least.
Maybe they can finally duke it out. But
So
like,
I mean, so talking about not say, and I think that point is granted, and I think it's interesting because I think both sides probably have what to consider from the other point of view there when sides are complaining there. Non-state actors, right? Obviously, Hezbollah. I think, to the best of my knowledge, the most powerful non-state actor in the Middle East, probably the world.
arguably the world by now. I mean, not by now. I'll say when the war started.
Um, Also a very interesting history. One of the things in which I've been seeing in a lot of, Arab social media now is a conversation about, let's say support for Hezbollah within Lebanon. There's a lot of obviously criticism by Syrians for Hezbollah supporting the Assad regime. I mean, let's just start there. Why did Hezbollah support Assad's side in the civil war in Syria?
So maybe I'll give a 2-minute history on Hezbollah, and like that'll help us understand how this developed. So in Lebanon, it was a very, very careful balance of different ethnicities and different political parties that throughout the 50s and 60s managed to find a way to coexist in an interesting development, an interesting political system. That balance changed as a result primarily of the PLO being expelled to Lebanon after it was expelled from Jordan. Lebanon cascades into a civil war in 1975. And as part of that civil war, you have the rising of new militias, and specifically also in association with this, Shiite militias in the southern parts of Lebanon. The big militia then was Amal. Then Israel invades southern Lebanon in 1982, alongside Syria also invading Lebanon earlier than that. Lebanon becomes a battleground between a lot of different armies, and at that time, we're also talking 3 years after the Iranian Revolution. Iran sees an opportunity here. They see a large Shiite community in southern Lebanon that are just being screwed over every which way. They're being screwed over by Israel, by Lebanon, by rivals within Lebanon, and by Syria. And they start funding a new group, calling it Hezbollah, the Party of God. Hezbollah, unlike the Houthis in Yemen and unlike other militias in Iraq, are they're founded by Iran. It's not just a militia that Iran decided to start funding. They are actually founded, born and raised by Iran. The Iranian advisors, Revolutionary Guards, came to southern Lebanon in order to establish it. Then the militia takes off and starts to develop in strength. Fast forwarding many, many years, but it remains a complete arm of Iran, again, different than alliance. Hamas, to large extents, is allied with Iran. The Houthis are funded by Iran and are somewhat allied with Iran. Hezbollah is not allied with Iran. Hezbollah is an arm of Iran through and through. It does what Iran says. It gets all its money from Iran, all its weapons from Iran, etc., etc. Then the Syrian civil war breaks out. In the Syrian civil war, the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad comes from an Alawite background. That is a minority population within Syria that is close to Shiites, as opposed to the majority of Syria that is Sunni. As a result, Iran supports the Assad regime. And when the Assad regime is doing really poorly, around 2012, 2013, Iran orders Hezbollah, send your troops in. Send your troops in to prop up the Assad regime. So there's an ideological connection between Hezbollah being Shiites and the Assad regime also representing Alawites that are close to Shiites. But more than that, it's the same thing with attacking Israel. Iran's very good at telling others, go send your soldiers in. They didn't send their soldiers in. They told others, go send your soldiers in. So as a result, Hezbollah literally sends thousands of soldiers and troops to uphold Assad's regime. They don't do as well as they thought they would. And as a result, within a year, Russia comes in and actually saves the Assad regime. But that's how it ended up happening. For that year, Assad was largely propped up by Hezbollah. As a result, Hezbollah is very hated by a large majority of the Syrian population. And in addition, it also has to do with the balance of power within Lebanon, right? A lot of people who are not Shiites, right, Christians, Sunni Muslims, and etc. within Lebanon also, on the one hand, see a lot of merits in what Hezbollah does, but at the same time also don't like that Hezbollah is essentially stronger than the Lebanese army. So all these things have brought together the fact that when Nasrallah is assassinated, many people across the Middle East, had a drink to that, as opposed to being upset.
And it seems like there's a real, let me know if I'm being too optimistic, given that, people both in Lebanon and Syria hate Hezbollah and by extension Iran and Iranian influence. Is there a chance that a lot of them are seeing the sort of wider trend of a lot of countries, coming back to, or not coming back, they were never really allied with the West, but kind of seeing what's been happening with the Abraham Accords, or even the situation of Jordan. Jordan's been fascinating over the last couple of months, right? Obviously signing a peace treaty with Israel in the 90s and, a very cold peace, but Jordan's been, answering America's call and helping shooting down the rockets from Iran. Is there any chance that the people of these countries or the Lebanese army or government is seeing this and saying, actually, there could be a roadmap to wider Middle Eastern peace? You already mentioned, even Hezbollah seems, I'll say these words. You don't have to agree with these words, but it seems like even Hezbollah is giving up on the Palestinian cause to some extent when things get difficult for it. I would imagine, all the more so if you're just a random Syrian or a random Lebanese. I'm sure you don't love Israel, just the same way I'm sure a random Egyptian or Jordan, I'm sure if you do Pew polling there, do you love Israelis? Probably not much, much better or worse in any of those countries. So is there an opportunity here for something to really change in the landscape?
I'd say possibly with the civilian population, unlikely with the governments. First of all, the Arab Peace Initiative that was put forth in 2002 still stands, and the Jordanian foreign minister mentioned it, even last month. So as far as the governments are concerned, they are willing to go to normalization with Israel. Whether they'll live up to this or not, that's a different question. But the official position is they're willing to go to normalization with Israel, but only as part of recognizing a two-state solution. It's hard to see a situation where the Palestinian idea is just abandoned and the governments decide, you know what, let's throw our weight in this direction. Even Jordan, that you mentioned, signed peace with Israel only after the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, Israel recognizing the Palestinian Liberation Organization, coming together in order to have a roadmap towards a two-state solution. That is what Jordan required in order to have a peace treaty.
But just to play devil's advocate, looking back, obviously, just to spoil for listeners, Oslo did not work there is no two-state solution. There is no peace, last I checked. And Jordan never really reneged on it. They've had a lot of comments that are, Israel's being bad, blah, blah, blah. But like Jordan now 30 years out is probably happy looking back that they were able to kind of, I'll call it ripping off the Band-Aid. I'm sure it was very difficult. Maybe, the way that I might phrase it, and, if you disagree with this phrasing, let me know. Oslo Accords gave Jordan the ability, the PR ability,
Yeah,
both
I don't
internationally to
disagree.
do it.
I,
Yeah.
I I don't disagree. And I'll say even more than that. Egypt signed peace with Israel without a roadmap towards a two-state solution. And more than that, in Egypt, there was, a revolution which led to elections, led to the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power, releasing hundreds of Hamas operatives who were held in Egyptian jails, and even Egypt did not violate the peace treaty with Israel. So much so, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel stipulates that not more than two armored divisions of Egypt can be in Sinai, underneath the Muslim Brotherhood government. Egypt wanted to send more troops into Sinai to fight ISIS, asked Israel for permission. Israel said no, and they were not sent. Whether that was a smart decision or not, different question. But they were not sent. So yeah, I'm not saying that the countries really want to live up to this. I am saying though that countries quote unquote need the opportunity, that need that excuse, like you were saying. Also, so be it. Right now, it's not there. Saudi Arabia has even tried to lower the bar and said, as long as there's an agreed upon roadmap that we can all, not even saying it has to be another state already, just a roadmap we agree on. Okay, but it's not there. So that's what I'm saying. In terms of the governments, right now, it's hard to see. In terms of the population, it could be, but I would not equate hatred for Hezbollah with a desire to rid yourself of Iran, or necessarily, ally yourself with the West or something like that. You have to understand the complexities of these countries, just like you need to, just like we have our own complexities, right? People, in the United States, sure, I'm sure a lot of people think that the United States should be harder on tariffs and stuff with China. Don't like that China, has basically slave camps and they're making cheap products that everyone in the United States is buying. Don't like this. Okay, but I'm still going to vote the way I vote now, because what I actually care about is how much my car costs. What I actually care about, same thing, to say that people are angry with Iran, they are angry with Iran. They don't like Iran's influence in a lot of ways when it comes to the Middle East. Nonetheless, they also much more care about a slew of other things, like stability, like not cascading into civil war, like oil prices, like a lot of things. So the fact that there is growing possibly anti-Iran sentiment or anti-Hezbollah sentiment across different Arab countries in the Middle East, I would not jump to say, therefore, are they going to see the light, that you would hope that they see. Their politics is just as complicated, if not more as complicated than us. It's not one narrow thing that's going to make them want to change their positions that have been held for so many years.
Sure. I mean, it has been interesting. I mean, again, maybe I'm in about, I'm spending a lot of time, again, the social scientist researcher in you is going to hate what I'm about to say. I was spending a lot of time on different, countries' Reddit pages, and you can tell a lot, I feel like, about, I mean, again, these are obviously all English speaking people. So already it's a very narrow margin of who's on this, but it's been very interesting, the Lebanese and Syrian, but mostly the Lebanese subreddit, again, there's hundreds of thousands of people there, and just following a lot of the conversations. Okay. Of course, none of them like Israel, but most of it is, talking about how terrible the Israeli strikes are in, the suburbs of Beirut. And every time it's, why the hell is Hezbollah operating out of these civilian population areas? You're just attracting, the Israeli occupation force, the evil IDF to come. But it's like, so it's like both. It's like Hezbollah is terrible and the IDF is terrible, but the immediate cause is, okay, they probably are so distant from Israel that Israel is going to drop bombs on when terrorist activity is. So their sort of narrow concerns are towards Hezbollah. And so it really does seem, I mean, I guess I remember talking to you, I asked you this question probably 7 months ago. I tried to find the podcast before we recorded, but I couldn't. I asked, if Israel has a vested interest in sort of sowing civil discord and a civil war within Lebanon. But all it seems like it would take, I mean, Lebanon has a separate army. I mean, obviously it's not as strong as Hezbollah, but at what point does the will of the people, American help, Israeli, maybe covert help, I'm sure it wouldn't be explicit, all come together and basically say, okay, Lebanese army is going to take back their country and Israel will sign a de facto, whether it's public or private peace treaty there, and kind of everybody wins. I mean, except for, of course, Iran. But I, I guess that's what I'm asking in the more optimistic way. It seems like that's close. And it seems like, I mean, I can imagine the rationale for Israel just pushing a little bit harder is, who knows how close they are, because Israel, unlike Gaza, where Gaza, the threshold for victory, according to Israel standards, seems impossible, right? What do you mean root out Hamas? Technically, all Israel needs to do in Lebanon is get to the point where, you said before, the two guys that know how to shoot, the three rockets, but it's not really true, because if there are only two Hezbollah guys there, in this fantasy, the Lebanese army would probably just come and arrest them as two domestic, people that are causing trouble. So really, all you need to do is change the power balance a little bit. Just to throw that back to you.
So first of all, it's been tried. When Israel invaded in 1982, it propped up a president, Bashir Gemayel, and signed a peace treaty with him. He was assassinated, and that didn't work. We've seen a lot of cases when the quote unquote West tries to prop up, let's just sow discord and then create a friendly regime in the
But
other
I'm not even
side.
talking about creating and I guess just to redo the question, I'm not saying America and Israel sit in close filled rooms with smoke filled rooms with the EU and like find some guy. There's already right now a separate Lebanese army. Now that Lebanese army doesn't love Israel, right? I'm not, I don't think this is going to be,
But you can't
America and
convince you
Canada.
can't convince a Lebanese army. I if I was a Lebanese civilian, I would hate Hezbollah, probably. I would hate what Israel's doing. I also wouldn't say, you know what? I think the solution to my country being bombed out of the sky in what I perceive a very unethical way is let me go have a civil war in order to get this to happen. I probably wouldn't think that. Like most civilians in the world, I would want the quickest solution to my problem, and I would say, and I'll deal with whatever happens after that. After that, I'm not going to start a process of a civil war that will tear my country down, especially after there was a civil war there for 15 years, in order to then have hopes that, a country that I consider unethical because it's bombing me, okay, how do I know they're not going to then decide to bomb the next militia? Or how do I know it's not going to decide, again, like, that you look at it as, well, chances are Israel won. Sure, I don't necessarily think that the average Lebanese who has seen Israel occupy large parts of its country for 18 years, besiege Beirut and be there for 3 years, then carry out these bombing campaigns, probably doesn't feel, if I just took out Hezbollah, Israel's a peace loving country. It just, like, it's not human nature to think this way. It's not human nature to look at things this way. And one of the most illuminating moments for me in discussing things like this was when I was talking to a friend of mine who's actually from Beirut. This is now a conversation that was 10 years ago, and we were talking about, understanding violence essentially, and I was saying, I understand that you can be against, we're talking about the Second Intifada. I said, I understand you can be against Israeli occupation. You can be for all kinds of things. You could think that, Palestinians deserve a state, that they're heavily mistreated, all kinds of things. Certain things you don't do. You don't get on a bus, look, babies in the eye and blow yourself up, even if there's lack of justice. And I was sort of amazed to hear from the flip side, just again, not because it's so bizarre to think about it, just that, like, the perspective from the other side was, I agree. I think that it's wrong for Hezbollah to fire missiles at Israel. I think it's wrong for what launched the Second Lebanon War for Hezbollah to carry out a cross-border raid and kidnap their people. You don't bomb neighborhoods to the ground. You just don't do that, even if it's wrong. To all of a sudden, just like hear the other side say, I too think that Hezbollah is wrong, and I think that what you're doing makes you so wrong, which is very akin to what a lot of Israelis may feel. I think the occupation is wrong. You can't do an October 7th. You can't blow up buses. You can't all kinds of things. Even just to see, like, yeah, but that's how possible. I don't know if my friend is the average person on the other side, but like, that could be something that's like so obvious that, like, I'm wrong. So I often think of that when I think of, like, so do I expect the other side? Like, do I think that it would be better for Lebanon to rise up and root out Hezbollah? Yes, I do. But then I think about that perspective, and I'm like, okay, but you know what? They have a million other factors to consider, and not anywhere on their list probably is, let's guarantee that Israel is secure so they don't bomb us anymore. That's just not the way you would tend to see things.
No, that is very interesting. So, and it kind of points to the conclusion, almost, just to highlight what you're saying. Both sides have reasons to be aggravated based off of a perceived misjustice. The other side thinks, even if they're granting the injustice, the other side is raising the stakes too high. It sort of is an argument for, okay, well, at the end of the day, you're just going to have to rely on strength. I mean, I don't really, because I don't see how you have diplomacy with that history of both sides thinking the justice lies on their side. And so,
But
I mean,
that's but then you would never have any peace treaty. Peace treaties are done between countries at war. Like, then you would never have peace treaty between the United Kingdom and Ireland. then you would never have peace treaties. I mean, like, I mean, the
Well,
list
it
is
seems like, I
endless.
mean,
Like,
I guess, on the contrary, in the Middle East, it seems like a lot of peace treaties have been made once you prove your strength, right? As opposed to, right, this is sort of the big, the age old debate of, the revisionist versus non revisionists, right? There's one way to make peace of saying, it's actually better in some utilitarian way for both of us if me and you make peace. Fine. There's another way to make peace if you're just way stronger than me. And every time I try to run at you, you easily
but
punch me back.
I don't think that's true. Iran and Iraq, maybe stopped their war, not when one side proved they were stronger than the other. Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and the Houthis, and Armenia, Azerbaijan. I mean, it depends how far we extend the Middle East. I mean, like, I don't think that's true. That is like only when you show force, but also more than that, you could say, and this is obviously an argument that a lot of a lot of countries have. So I just need to show more force. But okay, Israel again occupied southern Lebanon from 1982 till 2000. That is the time that Hezbollah grew in strength. Hezbollah was created in 1982, 83. By the time Israel evacuated in 2000, as a result of Hezbollah constantly attacking it, Hezbollah grew. Your force didn't work. You had a major display of force in 2006. Your force didn't work. Now you could say, well, diplomacy doesn't work either. I mean, one of the things that I often quote another very good friend of mine, is on something you said, I think, very short about a year ago, which was one of the interesting things of October 7th is it's going to substantiate all sides. Those who say you need to you need to have a diplomatic resolution are going to say, look, you've been besieging Gaza, occupying Gaza, doing whatever, and it hasn't worked. Go to diplomatic resolution. Whereas those who say no, you need to have more force are going to say, look, you've tried diplomatic resolutions, you withdrew from Gaza, you had the Oslo Accords, look what happened, you need to show more force. It's the same argument here. You're telling me possibly what you need is more force, and I could say yes, but obviously that hasn't worked. Now, in turn, you could throw back at me, okay, but diplomatic resolutions haven't worked either. They haven't brought. Both are true. Um, the difference is that I would argue, at least, um, looking at it from a terrorism research international perspective, diplomatic resolutions have worked in the world, and sheer force to destroy terrorist groups have never worked. So like that's at least where what I would rely on. And there's other examples where you could say like the diplomatic resolutions even in the Middle East with organizations have worked to some extent, but certainly in the world, and sheer force has never, with the exception of one very rare case in 2009. So like it's that's the trump card I would at least pull to look at it from a diplomatic perspective.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, so we've been talking for a while. So just two questions that when I was telling people that I was going to talk to you, these were planted in my head, and I had to promise that I would ask you these two questions. One is a media question. There's been a lot of interesting talk about the media. Let's say the BBC, NPR, refusing to call Hezbollah a terrorist organization, referring it to, as a militant group. You obviously are a scholar of terrorism. You're very particular of your definition of terrorism. I noticed you are referring to Hezbollah as a terrorist group. Is something lost? I mean, so the argument of sort of the quote unquote pro-Israel community is the BBC is just, this is just another example of anti-Israel bias. I'm sure if you ask the BBC, they're saying this is us doubling down on our, neutral position. I mean, what would you say as a scholar of terrorism? Is it important if they call it a militant group versus terrorism? Go for it.
So I'll say that first of all, I'm very careful in the way I use things, and I have called them militants and said Hezbollah operatives, not Hezbollah terrorists, because these things do matter. First of all, they matter for international law, but I think they do matter in how we have a conversation. Um, Hezbollah is the military wing of Hezbollah is defined as a terror group. That does not mean that all of Hezbollah is defined as a terror group. Hezbollah has politicians. Those politicians are not, again, by international standards. They're not defined as being part of a terrorist outfit. It's defined that one of Hezbollah's activities, the subgroup, if you will, which is again not different than defining terror groups. In North America, when you defined the Weather Underground, was at some point was defined as a terror group. That doesn't mean the entire Students for Democratic Society were defined as a terror group. There's one offshoot. So that's how the legal facet of what Hezbollah is defined as a terror group or not. At the same time, one of the things that I always tell my students is, okay, but if you are an organization, you carry out one act of terrorism, are you from now on always a terrorist? Are you always a terror group? If so, then Menachem Begin was defined as a terrorist too. Yitzhak Shamir was the leader of a terror group. So are they terrorists? Nelson Mandela. So are you a terrorist for the rest of your life because you were part of a terror group? I am very careful in the way I use the language when I was talking about those who fire rockets. If that is an act of terrorism, I call them terrorists at that moment. Otherwise, I say operatives or I say militants. It depends on which. Again, annoys everyone. There's no way to not annoy
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
I am
no, of
not
course.
justifying the BBC. I'm just
No, no, of
saying
course. And that was such
it's.
a rabbinic message to give before Yom Kippur. If you do one act once, or you always, I'm excited to hear the sermon in Shul when you give it.
Mhm.
No, but I think point granted. The second question I had, and you can feel free to take this however you want. Um, you have a lot of seemingly, split reaction between Trump and Harris in terms of how they're coaching Israel, at least in terms of what they're saying. Trump the other day tweeted out Israel should bomb Iran. The Biden Harris administration is urging diplomacy. What do you see in terms of, just zooming out the, 500 feet level? That's not that high, the 10,000 feet level. Trump versus Harris, Middle East policy. What do you like? What do you think, are the potential upsides, downsides of both of them?
I'm obviously not going to say what I like or don't like because, as you know, I don't give my own political opinion. I will say when it comes to how they relate to the war, it seems that a Harris administration would continue the Biden trajectory, possibly with a much more critical eye towards violation of human rights or war crimes. The Biden administration has been by far the most supportive administration of Israel in almost every account, in diplomatic resolutions that it has blocked either against Israel or put forth in Israel's favor, in the amount of international support that it has sent, in the amount of weaponry, the amount of money. I know that all the press is that they withheld one shipment of bombs. There are 5,000 U.S. Marines deployed across the Middle East just in order to make sure that no militia attacks Israel. U.S. service people have died in doing that. So I think that the Harris administration will probably continue that trajectory. However, Harris is being much more critical on the violations of human rights in the Palestinian territory, specifically in the West Bank, not in the Gaza Strip, and on the use of the type of weaponry that is used that may actually end up, making the United States somewhat culpable in U.S. based courts for selling weapons to Israel that is then used in these situations. So I think there will be a lot more criticism, but the trajectory will probably be the same. From a Trump presidency, I have no idea. Trump has also said that if he was president, this wouldn't have happened. Under his situation, the situation sort of escalated quite a lot in a lot of different Middle Eastern countries alongside the Abraham Accords. Um, he's also said that Israel should bomb Iran. He also said, though, that Iran would have never bombed Israel. I'm not sure why. At the same time, he also had a very, very close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then didn't speak to him for 3 years and utterly hated him, used words against him that I don't know if you allow on your podcast. Certainly not
Listen, Joe
politically
Walsh
cool.
dropped like 6 F bombs. I was very surprised. I think that might have been the first, the inaugural F bomb on J Life with Daniel. So
So you know what I'm talking about his division with Netanyahu. Now he's decided that he loves Netanyahu again. One thing that I will say about Trump, he has proven that historically that in the relationship of the balance in the Middle East, he likes to appear to be more on Israel's side. At the same time, he's also proven sort of time and again that he's unreliable. Saudi Arabia was relying on Trump for a lot of things, and then Trump decided to back out of that. The Afghan government was begging the Trump administration to not sign a deal with the Taliban. The Trump administration did release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. Within 6 months, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. This is the same United States that the Afghan government was relying on. So I think that Trump would certainly want to come off as much more on Israel's side, but I think that will be unreliable. And again, his relationship with Netanyahu, who knows what that relationship is going to be like? And also, who knows if Netanyahu is at some point no longer prime minister of Israel, what happens with the next prime minister and their relationship? Because a lot of the reason that Trump wanted to appear much more on Israel's side was also this sort of very special relationship that he forged with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But Netanyahu may not be prime minister forever. And then what will happen? So I think we know a little bit more what to expect from a Harris administration. Trump administration may be very pro-Israel, may be more volatile. I'm not sure, but we don't really know what to expect, is what I would argue.
fascinating. Well, whatever happens, we will definitely bring you back on to talk. I highly recommend listeners follow you at Alon Burstein on YouTube. Thank you again, Alon.
Thank you. Have a good night.